been a wonderful day. It's my first visit to Latin America, my first visit to Chile. And I've heard wonderful stories about community today, bringing people together. And I really, truly believe this, like all of us, that this is really the future. What I want to share with you is how I combine things. I'm basically a connector. And I'm going to give you an illustration how you can connect things that people think are not belonging together. I'm going to talk about art, science, and community, and how these three things can be completely brought together. I'm going to talk about an art project, and I'm going to talk about a scientific project. Let me start. This is inspiration for my artworks. Always use inspiration from areas that you wouldn't immediately expect. What you see on the top here are computers. And what you can basically see here is computers that have been modified creatively. It's called case modding. It's a very creative scene. People are having contests. They post photos on the internet. They're discussing their designs. And as a visual artist, when I first saw this, I immediately saw potential. I was like, this is really interesting as a sculpture. Maybe I can use this to create sculpture, larger sculptures. So that was the first part of inspiration that I got for the project that I'm going to introduce to you. Now, within this scene, within this subculture of case modding, it's not just about how things look like. It's also about how fast the machines are. It's a bit like car tuning. You know, people pimping their cars. It's not just about how the cars look like, it's also about how fast they are. Same thing here. One of the problems is when you overclock a computer, when you make a computer run faster, that it overheats. So you need to cool it. So you have all these elaborate cooling systems. And I thought, maybe we can do something more creative with this heat, with this excess heat, than just trying to get rid of it. And the third element that formed the source of inspiration for this particular project is e-waste. Electronic waste. We produce massive amounts of electronic waste, and honestly, a lot of the electronic waste, old computers, old cell phones, they're actually still working. And they end up in often poor countries where people will try to salvage metals by burning computers, for example. There are lots of videos about this. Children hunched over burning computer parts to try to extract metals, which is extremely toxic. So this whole huge problem of e-waste. And I was like, maybe I can do something with that as well. And this is where I got the core concept of my project. This is what it all boils down to. The Biomod project, because that's the name of the project, Biomod, is to build a sculptural computer system out of recycled components and then plant a living ecosystem inside the computer that uses the waste heat of all the electronics to grow and develop. So really building living biology within an electronic computer system and make them work together. That was the basis of this art project. Now, if you make an artwork, a computer artwork, and then you just put it in a museum or you put it in a gallery and it's not doing anything, that's not very interesting, right? So very quickly, when I was thinking about this concept, I decided to turn it into a network for computer games. So basically what would happen was I would have an interactive artwork. People would come into the museum, would come into the gallery, they would connect to the game. They would start playing games with other people. They would use the artwork. They would heat up the electronics. They would boost the growth of the ecosystem inside the computer by interacting. And so everything was connected: community, technology, and biology. The project really has many different layers, and I'm just basically adding layer after layer. I also decided to use a different way of creating art. And most artists, when they make a work of art, is either they do it on their own, either they have assistants that work for them. Most visual artists work like that. And I wanted to work differently. I wanted to use the concept of co-creation. Co-creation is very specific. It's not like I have an idea and I have a shape and I just need people to do it. No. Co-creation is more like I have a basic idea, I go to a community, I put it on the table, and together we give the idea its own unique shape. And that's when I started. I started in 2007 with this project. I was doing a residency at the Aesthetic Technologies Lab in Athens, Ohio, built a community around the idea, and we started experimenting and discussing. Typically, for these kind of projects, and for my community art projects in general, is that I work with people with many different backgrounds. And this is crucial. It's crucial for creativity. Just artists? No. Just engineers? No. You just need to mix all of that. And not everybody needs to be an artist. Of course not. You just bring people together, different perspectives, and that generates the most creative outcome. So this was the result. After 4 months of development, 4 months of experimentation, a computer network of 5 recycled computers, an ecosystem of different plant species, microscopic algae, and fish all working together. And then on the right-hand side, you can see people logging into the network and actually gaming with each other. This is one of my favorite systems of how plants and electronics interact. What you can see here on top is one of the 5 computers. It's a motherboard. It's a server of the network. Now, there is a processor. Every computer has a processor. Now, it's not being cooled with a little fan. It's being cooled using water cooling, which is another way of cooling computers. Now, what is different here is that it's being cooled using a culture instead of coolant liquid, instead of commercial coolant liquid. We use a culture of microscopic algae. Microscopic living organisms are being pumped through the mechanical heart of a computer and are actually actively cooling that computer. And the computer only functions because the algae culture is cooling it, and the algae culture grows better because it's being heated up by the computer. And in this way, it's symbiosis. Symbiosis between a computer chip and a culture of algae. Now, there was a bit of an issue because the algae were actually doing their job too well. They were overheating. So the algae were getting too warm, and that's not good. So we built a cooler for the cooler, and that's what we did here. So a simple heat exchanger, we pumped the warm algae through a fish tank, and the warm fertilized fish water was used to irrigate each individual plant in the ecosystem. So everything was connected. That was the first version. It was a big success. We loved it. The team loved it. I loved it. And I felt I wanted to continue with this. And I've been doing this since 2007. So I'm going to show you how it evolved. Now, a little detail or a little bit, let me explain a little more about the algae. These algae are very common algae. They're all over the world. And what I do is, whenever I do a project like this, I take the algae to the new country. And the thing is, if you with a little sample, you can actually create a big culture. And if you do that, the spores of these algae are also in the air, and they will mix with the algae. So I started in America, then I went to the Philippines, then I went to Europe, and I'm actually building a global culture of algae. I'm just keeping on traveling with it. For years I've been doing this. So in my studio, I have all these cultures, living cultures of algae, and they're all mixing together. So like I said, I also went to the Philippines. Why did I go to a completely different country? Well, if you work with the idea of co-creation, putting an idea on the table and then together working and looking for a shape of that concept, it becomes very interesting to go to a different culture. Because how would the same concept look like in a different culture where people have different ideas about art, different skills, different interests in general? So I ended up in the Philippines through friends of mine. And one of the things that struck me in the Philippines was that Filipino culture is really a very active community building culture. And they set up all these events to promote the project and to build the community around it. Another thing I did in the Philippines was I was actively tapping into local culture, actively connecting with local culture. What you can see on top is Mount Makiling. It's one of those holy mountains in the Philippines. The Philippines is Catholic, but still animist beliefs are still very present. Maria Makiling is the spirit living on the mountain. If you look carefully, you can actually see a naked lady lying on her back in the silhouette of the mountain. You can see her hair, and then her face and nose, her breasts, her belly, and her legs. She's lying there beautifully in the landscape. Now, most of the stories of Maria Makiling are actually ecological stories. It's about people going on her mountain, taking wood, taking fruits, not being respectful and being punished by her. How interesting was that? We were building an ecologically inspired artwork at the foot of a mountain embedded with ecological mythology. So of course we were going to connect things. So we used the stories of Maria McKeeling to shape the new version of Biomod. And we did it in two different ways. We created a Filipino computer game that was actually an abstract representation of those mythologies. And we worked with local wood carvers. Old technology, old tradition, very new tradition, right? And this was the result. A big, large structure with typical Filipino aesthetics, quite heavy. Traditional wood carving, a tropical ecosystem, aquaponics, a Filipino computer game, multiple sensors, and even a Twitter account by the main character in the computer game, all working and functioning together. And then I kept doing this. There's a last example that I'm going to show you. I also went to New Zealand, where I worked with Maori artist Joe Tito, a good friend of mine. And we connected Maori art with the Biomod idea. She's basically specialized in, that's one of her projects, that she looks for stones and that she finds in ancestral grounds. And then she makes these abstract patterns. She paints abstract patterns on the stones. So what we did was we built a cooling system with these stones, and so the warm algae were being cooled over this traditional Maori art, and they're just being pumped into the computer to make the whole system work. And so I'm always, wherever I am, I'm trying to connect different worlds, different ideas, and different media. Now, it's even more than that. People are building their own version of the project. People are picking up the idea and are building their own version of the project. So I call it, the next slide you can see it, open source art, which is something that you don't see very often, because art is part of an art market very often. You sell art and you sign art, and art is yours. You patent art almost, right? Now, I don't do that. I use a different model. People can use the name Biomod, they can build their own version, they can use the idea, and I think it's beautiful. I think that's the beauty of the artwork, that it spreads like, that it just finds its own way throughout the world. This was the last version that I did in New York City. And for this particular project, which is the last version that I'm going to talk about concerning Biomod, we had a very interesting community. First of all, I was invited by the New York Hall of Science in New York City, which is in an area which is called Corona in Queens. And in Corona in Queens, you have many Latin American people, like 95% of the population there is Latin American, mostly Mexican, but also from other places. So very quickly we were interested in working together when we were doing the project in the museum to work with the people living around the museum. Of course, it was a community art project. So one of the things we did was we gave workshops in urban gardening, how to grow your own food in a city like New York. And I gave workshops on how to transform electronic wastes into functioning computers. So I gave workshops to Mexican families, children and mothers. In 2 sessions, they had a functioning computer out of electronic waste, including software and everything. They could just do it on their own. Apart from that, I also worked with students in New York City. This was Parsons, the New School for Design. I worked with students there, included them. And last but not least, people from other Biomod projects from before came over to New York. People from Holland, people from the Philippines, people from Belgium. So I had this beautiful, rich community of different people from different parts of the world all working together on the project. This was the result. A bit similar to the other versions, a vertical structure containing an ecosystem, electronics, a network. But we changed a few things. And one of the things we changed is that all the plants were now edible. We were basically farming inside Biomod. And we were harvesting the food that we were growing inside our artwork. This is Diego from the Philippines, harvesting the tomatoes and turning it into a salsa sauce that we then ate. So, you know, how art can be edible. Also, we started making Biomod into a distributed artwork with it was present in different locations in the museum. So it was really also like a very physical network. And then something that is probably the most crucial of the biomod story that I'm bringing to you. And you really need to stay with me for a second. This is not easy, but it's very fascinating. So we have this system, an ecosystem inside a computer, and it functions as a network. We can go beyond this, and this is where it becomes, I think, very interesting. Imagine having sensors inside your ecosystem. Sensors that measure the state and especially the evolution of your ecosystem. It can measure humidity, light, growth, all of those things. Imagine that those data are manipulating the game world in real time. It's like playing a computer game and the garden around your house is having an impact on your game all the time. The sky changes in your game. The world in your virtual world is constantly changing. It's like you pull reality into the virtual world, right? That's the first step. Now, the second step is also interesting. Imagine giving the virtual world, an artificial intelligence in your computer game, a means to escape the computer and to manipulate reality. We can do that using robotics. We connect the artificial intelligence to robotics, and the robotics can take care of the ecosystem. It can give water, it can cut things away, it can turn on lights. If you establish a system like this, you create entangled reality. It's basically the real world and the virtual world are completely connected. And cause and effect are becoming entangled. It's impossible to say what is the cause and what is the effect, because as soon as this changes something, the other one changes, and they're just looping all the time, continuously. And that's what we established, that's what we created in New York in the biomod version. This is the virtual world. You can see the artificial intelligence over there. As a player, you needed to give the artificial intelligence virtual resources. And as soon as the artificial intelligence had enough resources, it started using the robotics to take care of the plants. So plant life, artificial intelligence, people were all dependent on each other. And that was the main message of this project. Now, when we're talking about robotics, it can be very simple. Don't imagine like big humanoid robots. No, no, no. This is, for example, a humidifier that we hacked, and then we connected it to the computer. And this is one of my favorite systems. This was built by the students. It's a watering system. It's basically a remote-controlled car, also hacked, with Arduino connected to a computer. So the computer can position the car exactly on top of a plant. And then, using this system, it squeezes a sponge and it actually slowly humidifies a plant. So this kind of systems we all integrated. All of this work, all of this exploration of bringing biology and technology in a new form, basically integrating them very strongly and as much as we can, drew the attention of the European Space Agency. And they invited me to work with them, which I started doing. I started creating artworks with the European Space Agency. And it's a specific research program of the European Space Agency that I started collaborating with. And they're called Melissa. And just briefly, what the Melissa research program tries to do is building an artificial ecosystem for future space colonization. You might be like, whoa, what's that? Well, it's an ecosystem that basically takes all molecules that come out of a human body, could be sweat, CO2, toilet waste, takes all those molecules, and then bacteria gradually break down those molecules and turn them into nutrients for plants and oxygen. And then the nutrients for the plants are used to grow plants, to grow crops, so the astronauts have food again. And then the cycle starts again. So that's part of the future of space exploration, is to have in English it's called a regenerative ecosystem. So this was, of course, also an example of integrating biology and technology. And actually, because of this collaboration, I rolled into the world of space exploration. I suddenly started going to conferences. I started sharing my work. People loved it. People from NASA were like, oh, this is very interesting. Let's see how we can collaborate. And a whole new world opened up for me. And this is how I ended up with my last project that I'm briefly going to introduce for today, the HI-SEAS project. I basically came out about 3 months ago. I came out of a NASA mission. I've lived in a geodesic dome with a crew of 6 people isolated in a Mars base on the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, practicing life on Mars for NASA. So we're basically trying to simulate living on the Martian surface. 4 months, 6 people. It was set up by the University of Hawaii and Cornell, and I was the crew commander of this mission. The main study, this is Jahaida, one of my colleagues, one of my crew members from Puerto Rico. The main goal of this mission was actually a food study. We're investigating how to create a food system for future survival on Mars. There's a big issue if you go to space for a very long time. You get sick and tired of the same food. It's called menu fatigue. It's also in the military. Soldiers do get sick and tired of their food. And you know what? You can use this in diets. A lot of diets use this psychological phenomenon. If you give people the same things over and over again, they're not so hungry anymore. But you don't want this for your astronauts. You want your astronauts to be strong and healthy, so you want to avoid it. So the solution we came up with is to allow astronauts to cook. And that's what we did. We were cooking. 2 days cooking, 2 days of ready meals. But the cooking could only happen with shelf-stable ingredients. Ingredients you can keep for multiple years without cooling. So it was a bit tricky to cook with that, but it worked pretty well. And then we had to weigh, film, and evaluate every single portion that we put on our plate. 3 meals a day, 6 people, 4 months. You can imagine the amount of data we have. So currently they're analyzing all this. Now, apart from the food study, we did all kinds of other scientific research. I did research on growing food using robots, for example. We also did EVAs. We did excursions outside, but then we had to wear a spacesuit. It's, of course, a mock-up spacesuit. It's not a real spacesuit. That's way too expensive. So really an incredible experience, I must say. And this was my crew. 6 people, different backgrounds, Russian-American, Canadian, Belgian, Puerto Rican, African-American. Very interesting. And as a commander, my main goal has been, during this mission, I really focused on crew cohesion, keeping people together. That was my main focus, how to do that. And I learned a lot about this. I don't have the time to give you all the details, but the main message that I can give to you is that my artistic explorations, my community building within the arts, has finally, in the end, led me to become a commander and to really work with communities, not just on Earth, but basically also in outer space. Thank you so much.